Get started now. Thank you all for joining us for this month's second Thursday lecture, brought to you by the Friends of the Cabildo and the Louisiana State Museum. My name is Katie Trevino, and I'm the Curator of Education at the Louisiana State Museum. And tonight we are joined by Zachary Turpin and Stefan Schoberlein, authors of Whitman Southern Sojourn, Rediscovering the Poet in New Orleans, 1848. Before we get started on the lecture portion, just a little bit of housekeeping. During the lecture, please stay muted. If you have any questions, just type them in the chat box, and after the lecture, we'll get to that. And let me see. After this lecture, you'll all get a recording tomorrow. And with that, I am going to hand it over to our guests.
Well, thank you so much, Katie, and thank you all for being here. We're really excited to tell you a little bit more of our research and just talk to you a bit about Walt Whitman's brief but fascinating journey to New Orleans in 1848. So I'm going to go ahead and share a slideshow with all of you now, and we'll get going. Okay, so again, I'm Zachary Turpin. My colleague Stefan Scherberlein and I recently wrote a book, Whitman's Southern Sojourn, Rediscovering the Poet in New Orleans, 1848. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Walt Whitman, the poet, just kind of get you settled into a little bit of knowledge about his early life. And then I'm going to tell you more about his trip to New Orleans and read you a few passages from our book, and then hand it over to Stefan. So to get things started, here's a cover image of our book, Whitman's Southern Sojourn. Yes, we both have our copies ready to go right here. And of course, we'll be providing QR codes both here and at the end of this presentation as well. So if you'd like to take a screen grab of this, and of course, I'll provide it again at the end so you can take a little peek. So first things first, you may or may not be familiar with the poet Walt Whitman. Here are several images of him over the course of his lifetime. But oftentimes people think of the good gray poet. You can see the elderly poet here with his sombrero and his long flowing white beard. Or maybe the young poet who is the author of the first edition of Leaves of Grass, seen on the left, with his cocky attitude and his hat tilted over sideways. But the Whitman that we're going to talk about today precedes any of these. The Whitman we have done research on and discovered some pretty extraordinary things about precedes them all. This is Whitman in 1848 in an image presumably taken in New Orleans. This is the first known picture of the poet, who eventually is one of the greatest poets in the English language. His relationship to New Orleans has been known. So in 1848, he goes to New Orleans for 3 months on an editorial assignment to help start a newspaper. These things have been known in his lifetime and afterwards by scholars. He worked at the Brooklyn Daily Eagle until he secured a new job, starting the New Orleans Daily Crescent in February 1848. But what Stefan and I each discovered as we were researching the subject is that it was what little was known about Whitman was based both on very thin evidence or oftentimes hearsay coming from the poet himself, or sometimes nothing. And also, there were there were just oddities sort of in the wind. For example, Whitman would often recount having been in New Orleans for longer than 3 months. You can see here in this manuscript that he wrote that he said, I was down in New Orleans, this is later in life, 1848 through 9, an editor in the Daily Crescent. He had only been in New Orleans from February through May of 1848. Why would he remember it being more than a year? This has often sort of pestered scholars. Stefan and I also recently and independently rediscovered a cache of letters that Whitman wrote back to the Daily Crescent after having left it under a pseudonym that he is now known to have used. It's a huge cache of letters that until now was not known, and it was very revealing. And so Stefan and I put our heads together and thought, this period in Whitman's life is known to have or is thought to have, unlocked him as a poet. It's Whitman's first big trip away from New York, where he was born and raised. It's the longest journey he ever took in his entire life, 4,000 total miles there and back again. And it's another huge urban center that seems to have gotten Whitman attuned to diversity and multiplicity and this like roiling, beautiful urban environment. And yet, so little was known that Stefan and I thought that this would be a project that we could really fruitfully work on together. So I'm going to tell you briefly about his trip down to New Orleans, and I'm going to read you some of his first impressions, and then I'm going to pass things on to Stefan. So again, Whitman was in February of 1848 just leaving his job at the Brooklyn Daily Eagle when he met a man named John McClure who offered him a job. He said, I'm starting a paper in New Orleans called the Daily Crescent, and you are the kind of guy who can start a newspaper. He's known for doing this in New York. So he paid Whitman several $100s. And 2 days later, Whitman and his brother Jeff were on their way to New Orleans. So they left Manhattan, which you can see here. The Brooklyn Bridge was not then in existence, so that's an anachronism. And they started the 2,000-mile journey down to New Orleans. You can see the downward arrow. He and his brother Jeff took carriages and trains and steamships down the Ohio River and then down the Mississippi River all the way to New Orleans. And along the way, they crossed the Alleghenies. And again, they take steamships and they, meet flat boatmen, and it's a 2 week journey to get from New York to New Orleans. And when they arrive, Whitman immediately helps begin um, getting this newspaper off the ground. So I can read you some of his first impressions of New Orleans in 1848. He writes them in the newspaper the week after it has first been published. So I'll be reading from the book. And I will also project some of these words too as I read. Okay. So this again is his first piece dedicated to his impressions of New Orleans. It's disguised as being written by a local, but it has certain references that make it clear that the author of this piece has not really yet experienced the New Orleans heat. So this is somebody who's brand new to New Orleans, much like Whitman. It's almost certainly him. So here we go. He says, does the gentleman, meaning the reader, desire to see an Atacapus bull, just imported from Havana, speared by an artiste of celebrity? If so, his wish can be fulfilled by visiting Algiers in the third municipality in the pleasant season of our southern summer. As for masquerade balls, we can only be beaten by gay, gallant, chivalrous Paris. And in the way of operas, we can't be beaten at all. There's the French opera at the Orleans Theater with its magnificent troupe, and occasionally we have those addicted to music from the fatherland who sing to our uneducated ears strains of the most mysterious sweetness. Again, once or twice in the course of the theatrical season, we have gems of genius in the way of vocalists from the, quote, sunny skies of fair classic Italy, end quote, who sing as if their very blood had been intermixed with the red currents that flow through the hearts of nightingales. If a person wishes to perforate his intimate friend or insolent enemy, he has only to go to some one of the numerous shooting galleries in New Orleans, and by the joint aid of a few dimes and 3 days' practice, he can be taught to split a bullet against the edge of a penknife at the distance of 10 paces. Those too who are fond of playing with edged tools will, by applying to some of our fencing masters, be taught how to pink a gentleman in a manner that Chevalier Bayard would have wept at. More than this could not be desired. I wonder if you can still do that in New Orleans. Now, as for our national drama, we have all the materials necessary. Stars from Europe, from Britain, and I sometimes from our wild Western states appear week after week at the different theaters, which temples of drama are, we suppose, better patronized than any others in the land of the free and the home of the brave. Those who come to visit us, like the person writing this, of course, albeit for a season, like the person writing this, must never think that the Queen City of the South is deficient in amusements, for they can enjoy themselves at anything in the way of drinking, from a glass of the waters of the muddy Mississippi up to a golden goblet filled with Roman punch, in the way of eating, from a moldy sea biscuit with a slice of rusty bacon up to broiled pompano with terrapin eggs and asparagus. And in the way of music, from the tooting of a penny whistle up to a soul entrancing strain of a silver bugle in the still, solemn hours of night. The fact is that in this goodly city, we can go through the whole alphabet of enjoyment, as they say in the West, not miss a letter from A to Izzard. And what I can tell you about this is that this is almost certainly Walt Whitman, and it's referring to those who visit us, albeit for a season. So, as we say in this book, considering that Whitman, as we theorize, had basically only planned to spend the spring in New Orleans, while plans for another newspaper in New York were in the works, the Freeman, this sort of fiery free soil paper. This suggests Walt may have been hired for a short tenure in mind. So, something that Stefan and I have been thinking about as scholars of Whitman is that much of his time in New Orleans is mythologized. Um, Whitman liked to say that he had been, sort of fired from the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, and that it was just this sort of like hostile falling out, and that later that he would be sort of let go in a chilly way from the Crescent. All these very dramatic ideas about, being fired by editors who don't understand him. And of course, later biographers like to maintain this idea of drama. So when they read Walt Whitman's journalism, from the period, they often think of Whitman as being entranced by the sort of sensuality and sexuality of the city, and maybe falling in love with someone, some sort of woman lover of some kind. These myths that Whitman did not try to dispel. And what we have found in our research is that many of the things that occurred during this trip to New Orleans, um, for Walt Whitman, were frankly more premeditated. They had very little of the kind of drama of firings, and it's also very unlikely that Whitman had a grand love affair, certainly not with a woman, in New Orleans in 1848. So one of the jobs of Whitman scholars, as well as scholars of New Orleans of the period, like Stefan and I, has been to try to demythologize some of this and see the real texture and see the real people involved. Um, do I have time to read one more passage? I don't know. Okay, here. I'm going to briefly give you a bit more of Whitman's first impressions. Okay, so this will just be me talking. Okay, and this is from the book. This is just a couple more pages. So, as Whitman would later recollect, quote, the city of New Orleans had been our channel and entrepot for everything going and returning, end quote. So he would remember, quote, the crowds of soldiers, the gay young officers going or coming, the receipt of important news, the many discussions, the returning wounded, and so on, the diagonally wedged in boats, the stevedores, the piles of cotton and other merchandise, the carts, mules, Negroes, etc., afforded never ending studies and sights to me, end quote. So, in particular, Whitman loved watching people. And this is something that's true throughout his journalism, throughout his poetry. And it's certainly something that he just wallowed in New Orleans. Um, so he says, for example, I made acquaintances among the captains, boatmen, and other characters, and often had long talks with them, sometimes finding a real rough diamond among my chance encounters, end quote. And he would later frame the diversity in particular of New Orleans, especially its racial multitudes, as a particular value to him at the time. So, for example, he remembered visiting the French Quarter and its Catholic cathedral as follows. He said, quote, I used to walk a good deal in this arrondissement, and later, quote, deeply regretted that I did not cultivate, while I had such a good opportunity, the chance of better knowledge of French and Spanish Creole New Orleans people, end quote. And then finally, Whitman would often recollect figures from the street. So he's a kind of peripatetic, I guess the French term is flaneur. This he casts himself as a writer who is kind of a walker on the street, capturing these local personalities. For example, a coffee seller whom he remembers as follows. Quote, one of my choice amusements during my stay in New Orleans was going down to the old French market, especially of a Sunday morning. The show was a varied and curious one, among the rest, the Indian and Negro hucksters with their wares. For there were always fine specimens of Indians, both women and men, young and old. And I remember I nearly always on the occasions got a large cup of delicious coffee with a biscuit for my breakfast from the immense shining copper kettle of a great Creole woman. I believe she weighed 230 pounds. I have never had such coffee since. This is a memory that sticks with him for the rest of his life. I'm now going to pass things over to Stefan Schuberlein, who's going to give you some more texture. You're muted, Stefan.
Okay, my bar to unmute briefly disappeared. All right, thank you so much for setting this up, Zach. Thank you all for being here. Um, Zach had mentioned, right, that Whitman is a walker, flaneur, right? And Whitman's home base at the time is right here, if you can see my mouse, in what then called the American Quarter, which is right next to the French Quarter. And he stayed, and we've marked in this map a couple of the locales that I mentioned, and you can tell this is all in walking distance, right? Whitman loved to take his extended walks, sometimes with his brother, sometimes by himself, and that has often been used to describe Whitman as a sort of lazy journalist or lazy writer, but really this is Whitman sort of mining the city and his experiences of the city for things to write about. Um, so for Whitman, that home base looks a little bit like this. This is the modern view of St. Charles, right facing what was then the St. Charles Theater. This is, I believe, the only photograph of the St. Charles as it looked like in the late 1840s, 1851. It burns down, gets rebuilt sort of in a similar style, but without a dome. Then it burns down again. Then there's a couple of teardowns and burn downs, and now it's hardly recognizable. But the street setup is still the same, and you can see that the buildings leading up to the St. Charles are still sort of roughly familiar if we look at this old image. So this is really where Whitman's life is centered. And going out into the French Quarter, which is just a short walk from there, was really fascinating to Whitman because he was described it as him walking into France from America. It's a mind-boggling experience, even for somebody growing up in a very sort of multicultural city like New York, right? It felt to him like the nation of France is right next door, and that's going to be important when we think about the 1848 revolutions in Europe, and I'll touch on that in a second here. Right across, so this is would roughly have been where he had lived. There's a famous oyster saloon run by a very close friend, potentially lover of one of the editors of the paper that Whitman worked for, The Crescent. I believe it's a little bit hard to map because the house numbers changed so much. There's a likelihood that we see the oyster saloon sort of in one of these buildings facing the St. Charles here. Zach had read that sort of description of Whitman of the city, and he talked about the shooting alleys that existed, right? These were very long buildings. You can see how long this oyster saloon is, right? You can imagine how a shooting gallery might fit into there. Lots of sort of multi-use buildings crowded with newspaper offices, fitness studios, dance halls, bars, and saloons. And the Whitmans, so Whitman and his teenage brother Jeff lived sort of right in the middle of it. This is a view of that same locale, but from the other side. We see Lafayette Park in the front here. We see a rebuilt St. Charles Theater here. And we believe that Whitman's newspaper was in this building, and he would have lived across the street from that, probably somewhere around here. It's a little bit hard to pinpoint. We know a little bit about his boarding house that he lived in. He enjoyed it greatly. He loved the food. The first place that they stayed in for the first couple of days was very rough, and they complained a lot about the smells and all of that. And then they were connected to this boarding house by a Catholic businessman called Patrick Irwin, and everything changed for the better. And they kept both Whitman brothers kept raving about the food specifically, even though it got a little bit noisy. And on the back of this check for their stay for the whole period, essentially, we have a little sketch. Maybe this is Whitman trying to sketch out what this Tremont House boarding house would have looked like. You can see he's probably a better writer than a pencil artist, but it certainly looks a little bit like some of the buildings you can see here. So that's a good chance that this is Whitman's amateurish attempt to draw Tremont House, which almost inevitably burns down when the St. Charles Theater burns down in 1851. So that is gone, but at least we have this artist's rendering, I would guess, right? This is another view of Lafayette Square. Again, Whitman's home base. You can see a couple of the buildings around, many of them still in existence, right? You can walk through Lafayette Square today, and you can wonder about the live oaks that you see there, if some of those may have inspired Whitman's live oak poems about New Orleans that he produced later in life. But you can see that this is sort of gives us a kind of visual representation of how one might encounter the city through its sort of citizens. And Whitman writes about that repeatedly, right? We have a lot of pieces that are published in the Daily Crescent that scholars of Whitman now describe as peeps. which is basically, hey, I'll take you by the hand, we'll walk through the city, and we'll talk about the kind of people you meet there. This was really exciting reading for people in the 19th century. It's always slightly humoristic, and it takes you basically from throughout the city, from the high places to the low places, right? What we have here is sort of a quick comedic piece about it's a little bit longer, but in there, for instance, we meet a wealthy married couple, and they obviously have different things on their mind, right? There comes a wealthy old merchant with his wife hinged to his arm. He goes to church because his wife makes him go. She says it's so respectable, and he's obliged to submit. And it goes on like this, right? And sort of satirizes both of them in a kind of well-meaning way. She's very pious, but because she wants to appear pious, he's very business-minded, and they have a little bit back and forth. This is sort of typical 19th century writing, and Whitman excelled at it. He was known for it. And that's something that was really popular with readers. And you can see this has little character sketches in there as well. Whitman spins this idea into a 13-part series that he publishes and the Crescent, which is called Sketches of the Sidewalks and the Levees. Zach has talked about one of the discoveries that we made, the sort of trove of letters that comes after Whitman had already returned to New York and is sending them back. This series is actually much longer than Whitman scholars believed in the past because he also sends a couple of installments of this series back from New York. And it's essentially a larger scale version of what we looked at, where he follows one person, usually a visitor in the city, through the streets of New Orleans and sort of describes the funny encounters a person like that may have, right? It's humoristic, it's sometimes a little bit sentimental, right? There's the businessman who wasted all of his money in frivolities, right? There's the old spinster who should have had children instead and has now sort of degenerated into spinsterhood, right? It's very typical 19th century fare, but something that sold papers and that Whitman was particularly good at. And obviously, he writes about other things that he experiences in New Orleans, right? He goes to Mardi Gras, right? This is St. Charles, like a later depiction from the 1860s, and he writes about it. And he sort of talks about some of the customs typical in Mardi Gras, like throwing flour at people, right? Lots of street brawls, but also the flower throwing, right? And he says here towards the bottom, the celebration of Mardi Gras is very pretty, but throwing flour in the face of a man whose imagination is not flowery is an unpoetic act and moreover a diabolical abomination. Right? And then he sort of goes back into a reporting mode, right? Whitman is sort of quick-witted, humoristic. This is the kind of style that people would hire Whitman to produce in their papers, right? He also goes to sort of risque performances. There's a theater troupe called the Model Artists that had just come down from the north, and Whitman probably encounters them for the first time here, called the Model Artists, and they're today described as sort of an early form of burlesque. They're usually depicted as performing in the nude, even though instead of that, they wore very tight-fitting, flesh-colored suits. So they weren't technically nude, but most people, including Whitman, describes them as nude performances. And they were supposed to be high culture, right? You would have these quasi-nude young men and women. And what they would do is they would be on these rotating platforms and they would reenact scenes from either famous plays or more often from famous paintings, right? And very often they're Adam and Eve paintings, right? For obvious reasons. But it has sort of this gloss of high culture. There's music under it, but you can see what people got out of it, right? If you look at the bottom here, you can see sort of the old men with their peepers zooming in, right? Trying to get as close as possible. Very scandalous. These performances would get banned in basically every major city they would hit or would be allowed to perform under restrictions. But at the same time, they were very popular. Henry Clay went to go see it. Presidential candidates would go see it, right? Very few women went to go see it. But Whitman went to go see it, and he reported on it frequently for the Daily Crescent, and he gave him a sort of ringing endorsement in a number of editorials. He kept promoting the troupe, right? And here's one of them. They're quite long, right? But we can see sort of inklings of Whitman's views of sexuality that we would later see articulated in Leaves of Grass, right? The celebration of the human body as where not an inch or a particle of an inch of it is would be considered vile to Whitman, right? And he says, The only objection that we can conceive of to the undraped figure arises from an assumption of coarseness and grossness intended. Take away this, and there is no need, in the cases under discussion, right, in these performances, of any objection at all. Eve in paradise or Adam either would not be supposed to shock the mind, right? So he's basically buying into the sort of high culture gloss of this and saying, this is great, we should all go see it. But then he sort of begrudgingly mentions that all of the people that go to see it are generally men. But this is sort of part of Whitman's sort of cultural criticism that happens in New Orleans. And then obviously, I've teased this already. 1848 is a really important year globally, right? Beginning in France, there's democratic uprisings all across Europe. And it begins a little bit earlier, but obviously news takes a while to get to the United States. And when the news really hits that there's a revolution, another democratic revolution in France against monarchic France, New Orleans is obviously elated. There's dress fads where people dress up either in French colors or there's specific hats modeled after French revolutionary figures. And there's a number of public assemblies where basically the various ethnic minorities in New Orleans, from the French to the Germans to the Italians to the Hungarians, have public meetings, have celebratory marches and music, and endorse the various democratic revolutions that are going on in Europe. And Whitman goes to at least one of those. He obviously notices this sort of enthusiasm all across New Orleans, but we can at least pinpoint to one event that he probably went to. That's in the Orleans Theater that Zach had already mentioned in Whitman's little sort of introductory gloss of all of the excitements in New Orleans, right? It's in the French Quarter. Whitman goes to cover the events, and it's sort of a lengthy piece, but he describes basically, I think a French consul is there, the mayor is there, I think the governor is there. It's a big deal, and everybody gets really worked up and very drunk, and there's money raised, and it's sort of this big vaguely European event that Whitman is really taken about, but the way that he glosses it here, I'm just going to read a little bit from the end here, where he basically said at a certain point, it's getting too much and we're leaving, which is a typical move for these peeps. When in the end, you sort of sum it up again and you take the reader by the hand and walk them out the door, right? And he sort of talks about all of the different toasts that happen, and then he says, in the end, many more toasts were given, and speeches which we have hardly space to refer to. And even if we had, we would be unable to do so as we did not hear them. Moreover, after this time, it would have been necessary to have been gifted with half a dozen pairs of hands, an equal number of ears, and the power of ubiquity besides to report on the proceedings. Every gentleman seemed perfectly willing that everyone else should speak, so that he was permitted to exercise his oratorial faculties at the same time. In view of this state of affairs, not considering that we could be of any further use, and having gratified our appetite and our Republican enthusiasm, we concluded to leave, which we accordingly did before the ceremonies ended, right? So that's sort of a nice wrap up, but we get at least sort of Whitman's affect, right? It's a little much, but he's enthralled, right? Sort of the flip side of what he calls Republican enthusiasm is also true, though. Zach mentioned returning soldiers in one of the bits that he read, right? These are soldiers returning from the Mexican-American War, right? The United States had been waging an imperial war of conquest against the Mexican Republic since 46. The fighting had essentially concluded right before Whitman arrived in New Orleans, and you can sort of see in this map from Wikipedia that New Orleans was this really important port, right? A lot of news from Mexico traveled through New Orleans to the north. This is probably where Whitman first encountered newspapers from New Orleans by receiving them in the mail in the north and then copying the newspaper coverage. But also troops would go out from New Orleans to fight Mexico. And right, Mexico had been defeated basically by the time the Whitmans arrived. But what was taking place instead was sort of a long treaty process. A peace treaty was being drafted, and there's some contentious back and forth. And Whitman in this time and at least into the 1860s is also a staunch sort of American chauvinist and imperialist. He fully endorses the war against Mexico. And in the Daily Crescent, and with the support of the paper, it was a sort of common attitude in New Orleans, he agitates against peace with Mexico, right? There's already significant secessions, right? A lot of the southwestern states and that, right, New Mexico states like this, right, would be incorporated into the United States as American states, right? But Whitman agitates for further expansion, right? He says in the middle of this, one of the earlier pieces that he writes, which he actually signs with a little W at the bottom, is he says, we will see that a peace between the United States and Mexico is impossible, and it needs no great learning or wise reflection to perceive that when such a relation exists between states, right, a warring relation, the weaker must yield to and become incorporated within with the stronger. And this is a sort of staple of Whitman's ideology at the time. He perceives Mexico as sort of this strange bulwark of European style monarchy, right? It's a presidential unitary republic with a strong president. Whitman opposes that, and he publishes in his paper at the time things we would call fake news today, right? Articles that claim that this peace treaty was actually written by a English diplomat and on behalf of the English crown to weaken the United States, right? He keeps agitating against it. It ultimately is ratified. Whitman is outraged. We have a lot of sort of punning editorials in the vein that we've encountered here earlier, where he basically bemoans the peace treaty. And then later from New York, he actually endorses filibustering efforts. So amateur incursions armed into Mexico to sow ferment and have, following the model of Texan statehood, white-led mini republics within Mexico declare independence with the goal of joining the United States. That way, none of them ever really materialize, but most of them have Whitman's express support, and we can get some of that support in the discovered letters that Zach mentioned earlier. And all of these, there's a sort of wide span of writings, right? From light entertainment to sort of hard-hitting political agitation to sort of cultural criticism in a way that's somewhat daring. All of this happens in the pages of the Crescent. And Zach had hinted at some of the debate that exists in scholarship around Whitman's involvement with the Crescent, and this has a lot to do with how scholars tended to look at 19th century newspapers, which is actually a little bit misleading. These are the first 2 pages of a typical issue of the Crescent, and actually the most important stuff usually happens on the second page. The first page is generally 50% ads and announcements, and then at least 2 columns of either light fare, like prose or poetry, entertainment reading that you would read slowly, and the news on the second page, hidden by the first page, so you can't just read it on the newsstand, you actually have to buy it. And the assumption was always, hey, if Whitman was the editor of this paper, he would be fully in charge of what is called the editorial column, which is generally maybe the second half of the first and definitely the second column. This is traditionally where people believe the editor spoke. The Daily Crescent worked a little bit differently. There's a couple of people that write in this. And as a result, there's not a lot of typically Whitmanian things in there. And scholars in the past have used that to describe Whitman as sort of marginalized or sidelined or too, quote unquote, politically progressive for a Southern paper like this. And in writing our book, we discovered that's really not the case. And especially early newspapers were really sort of an all hands on deck affair where writers would typically write in basically every single section of this paper. Sometimes on the first page, if it's like a piece of poetry that Whitman, for instance, wrote, sometimes in any of these columns on the second, sometimes on the third. And we can find Whitman's voice in all of them. And we can speak a little bit more about attribution and the technicality of that at the end if people are interested in that. But yeah, Whitman's writing on a number of different topics in basically every section of this paper, except, and I'm assuming that's a sort of a question that's bubbled up to some people here in our meeting, except for slavery. And that's another reason why scholars have described sort of Whitman's involvement with the paper as probably minimal or non-existent, or he was just doing technical things in the back end, because we now think of Whitman as this abolitionist poet, right? If we've read some Whitman, we've probably encountered his I Sing the Body Electric, which seems to be this really powerful outcry against a slave auction, right? And the scholarly consensus was always, right, this is something that Whitman saw in New Orleans. It outreached them, but he couldn't voice it in his paper, so he brought it with him and he voiced it later. And in writing this book, we discovered that that's really not the case, and that it's important to look at Whitman in the 1840s in a sort of more nuanced lens, because he's not an abolitionist proper, right? He doesn't in his public writing front a moral outrage over slavery, but he's what is called a free soiler. And I'll describe this very briefly, but we can go into more detail there later. A free soiler is essentially sort of a labor rights fringe movement originally within the Democratic Party. And then in 1848, they split from the Democratic Party and run an independent presidential candidate that failed sort of miserably, but ultimately leads to a longer discourse around free soil, which leads to the creation of the Republican Party. Free soilers, like Whitman, were opposed to slavery, but on economic grounds. They argued against slavery not as a moral wrong, which was more sort of the purview of the conservative Whig Party and conscious Whigs, but in slavery posing undue competition on free white labor. So Whitman would, in specifically New York, pitch to his largely white working class readers the argument that, hey, slavery might happen somewhere else, but it's there to attack you and your labor. So it's almost like a proto-Marxian argument. At the same time, it's sort of morally a little bit bankrupt because it generally, as a movement, refuses to speak on sort of the moral wrongs of slavery. And we can see hints of this kind of free soil persuasion in the Daily Crescent, right? Depending on how it's framed, it's an argument that could be made. There's fellow writers that outright argue for communism in the pages of the Daily Crescent without really touching the subject of slavery, and Whitman falls in line with that. And as Zach had mentioned, there's this other paper that Whitman works on during this time that's planned before, and that he starts working on as soon as he returns from New Orleans. That's a Brooklyn Freeman. And that's actually the party paper of the Free Soil Party, right? This originally democratic movement that then opposes the Democratic Party and runs Martin Van Buren for president in 1848. Whitman is sort of the sole voice of this paper, the main editor. So all of the writings are very likely Whitman's. And it's a really interesting paper. Most issues are lost today, but we have the first issue. And in the first issue, there's numerous sort of homages and references to the South, specifically a piece called Our Enmity to the South, where he basically says, we have none. And he makes a sort of free soily argument, sounding a little bit more abolitionist here, but he basically says that the free soilers are not the enemies of a very respectable body of slave owners who, the same as we, condemn slavery. That must also be evident. For we wish nothing towards them except what they wish. It remains then that we can only be charged with enmity towards an aristocratical minority, some 15th or at the utmost some 10th of the white inhabitants of the South who hold bondsmen, right? So he makes this sort of argument that he is opposed and the Free Soilers are opposed to slavery because it's this monarchical, feudal system that exploits both black and white. And that's sort of Whitman's argument that he's making here. And even from New York, he's pitching that towards the South. And in his letters that he sends back, he does the same thing. He reaches out to the South and tries to make these sort of radical free soil arguments rephrased for a Southern audience that would largely object to outright abolitionist agitation. And just to wrap things up, we originally hoped that all of these writings that we discovered would end up on the Walt Whitman Archive. We're both associated with the Whitman Archive, largely working on digitization projects aiming at identifying and making available online for free all of Whitman's journalistic writings and other writings. After we had drafted most of this book, we actually were part of a grant team that followed up on some of our initial hints and identified about 200 pieces that Whitman wrote for the Daily Crescent. We were able to fold some of that research into the book as well. And right about now, we were supposed to release all of them on the Whitman archive. But unfortunately, as you may have heard, we received a stop work order. Our grant was canceled, quote, in furtherance of the president's agenda. So for now, all of this work has stalled. We're hoping that in the future we will be able to return to this work and essentially just finalize and finish what we've already put in significant work for, but that's sort of up in the future. Currently, we're working on a grant looking at the paper that Whitman worked at before he came to New Orleans. So there are still connections. We're looking at that original fade and how he got connected to New Orleans. And the goal is to ultimately return to the New Orleans work and finalize that and publish it all annotated on the Whitman archive. For now, there's our two books. I had mentioned that in the chat as well. We're not making any revenue with them. All of the author's proceeds, which are minimal for an academic book, they're all going to the Whitman Archive with the goal of slowly but surely allowing the Whitman Archive to be a little bit more independent from sort of fickle granting landscapes. The book on the left is our monograph that we just published. The book on the right is a selection of Whitman's writings, sort of a reader's edition, specifically about New Orleans, that is I published a couple of years ago with LSU Press. There's links to both of them. And with that, I think we conclude that portion, and we're excited to get into a conversation, hear what questions people have, and again, explain whatever else needs explaining here. Thank you so much. And I'm going to stop sharing here.
Thank you both so much. That was incredibly interesting. The 1850, or I'm sorry, the 1840s in New Orleans is so fascinating. In that decade, the population doubled, so it really is an incredible time to see Whitman exploring the city. We have a few questions. Let's see. Can you explain more about how you all discovered the letters?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Stefan and I both do similar work with digital archives. And I think, as I recall, each of us kind of independently came to some of these and then connected with one another, basically saying, have you seen this before? Whitman, after he returned to New York in 1848, so in May, he effectively severs himself from the Crescent. You know, it's gotten off the ground, and he and his brother leave. His brother Jeff has dysentery and is not feeling well, so they go back to New York, and he founds that Brooklyn Freeman. Um, to the best of anyone's knowledge, that was it with New Orleans, other than referring to the South in the Freeman and, sort of generally reminiscing about it later, writing poetry about it. There was not a lot of further connections known. But Stefan and I each found that in the Crescent, shortly after he had left, and for a fairly significant period thereafter, there were these long letters from New York that were signed Mannahatta. So not Manhattan, but Mannahatta. I can even put it in the chat. Um, which is a fairly unusual construction of the name of the primary island of New York City. It comes from I think it supposedly comes from an Algonquin or a native name for that island. And this is now known to be one of Whitman's preferred pen names. He used it several times thereafter in known ways, and also would often refer to the island in that way. Um, so in addition to these letters being written back from New York at the time that Whitman would have been there, they also refer to many different things that Whitman is known to have seen, or that it would make sense that he have seen. They're signed in this way, although they eventually begin to be signed Manhattan. And they even refer to Whitman himself in one of the later letters. So Stefan and I began to realize that what we had here was likely a set of letters, and a fairly large amount, that Whitman had um, sort of written back as a form of, it's called Northern correspondence. As Stefan mentioned, newspapers of the period often relied on lots of different ways to get content. So they would have newspaper exchanges where they would send one another papers, their own papers, so they could share, like it says in the Brooklyn Freeman quotes the New Orleans Daily Crescent as saying, or the Daily Crescent quotes, the Austin American Statesman as saying. But correspondence of the sort was another way to fill columns, but also to get people to see news from different perspectives in this growing United States. And as Stefan mentions in the chat, of course, you can read all of these letters on the Whitman Archive, which again, the Whitman Archive is the digital playground of all playgrounds for all things Whitman related. Stefan, you have anything to add?
No, that sounds about correct, right? And it's one
Yeah.
of those truisms, right? The crescent is only of interest when Whitman was physically in New Orleans,
Mm,
right? That's sort of what everybody just assumed, and nobody actually went back to the actual issues of the paper to
mm,
look at it again, right? And we have the great benefit that all of these, or a lot of these newspapers are now available in a searchable format on platforms like newspapers.com or Chronicling America, where you can actually search for keywords and do this kind of reading much more easily. And there's really no reason to confine yourself to that period. That's another thing we learned about other newspapers that Whitman worked for. We mentioned the Eagle, for instance. We now know that he kept writing for the Eagle into the 1860s, including when he was allegedly having fights with the editors. So no paper is really in Whitman's life confined to a specific period where he was in the office working on the daily. He would keep sort of a repertoire of different papers that he could pitch stuff to at the back of his hand. And if he could get something in, he would. It's very sort of a gig economy, newspaper writing at the time.
Thank you. Hold on, I have another question. Can you explain more about Whitman's views on race later in his life?
Whitman, so this is definitely going to have to be both of us. Whitman's views on race throughout his life are um, shall we say, complex and evolving. So, as Stefan mentioned, that there's a lot of Whitman's poetry specifically that is very liberated and abolitionist sounding and very open-armed and egalitarian and not only interested in, but kind of agog at multiplicity and diversity. There's passages from Song of Myself that talk about this speaker figure nurturing a runaway slave and putting plasters on his wounds and feeding him. There are passages that talk about black bodies, men and women. He mentioned I Sing the Body Electric, which basically the speaker kind of steps in and takes over a slave auction and says, "Look at this beautiful human with the same running red blood inside." You know, it's very progressive and liberated, and certainly anti-slavery. But Whitman himself is more complicated. Stefan mentioned when he's in New Orleans in 1848, he sees slave auctions, and we know his brother Jeff found them very distasteful, and we assume Whitman did as well. But he has a more complicated relationship to slavery. You know, he's a free soiler, which means he is against the extension of slavery into new states. But he's not an abolitionist. He's not a member of the Liberty Party, which was a very small fringe party at the time, which said slavery should be abolished. Later in life, here's what I can say, and then I'll pass it on to Stefan. Later in life, Whitman's views on slavery are further evolved by his experiences nursing men during the Civil War, nursing Union soldiers. So he clearly understands the stakes of the question of chattel slavery and its abolishment. But later in life, when he's old and living in Camden, New Jersey, he has a friend slash secretary or amanuensis who basically chats with him every day and records every single thing he says in shorthand for 4 years. So we have 4 years of Whitman talking every day about whatever comes across the transom. And he often speaks about racial matters in private there in ways that are he's clearly keeping it out of his poetry and his productions, but they're pretty distasteful. And this is fairly common in the 19th century too. There are many figures who we now think of, and rightfully so, as being active abolitionists, who had much more complicated reasonings behind it, and reasonings that today don't always stand up to scrutiny. Um, Stefan, what do you want to say? I mean, this is a whole can of. I mean, there are books about this.
Yeah, I think that that's a good way to phrase it. I think Whitman is one of many writers who tend to be much better in their literary output that they than they were in their private lives, right? Whitman certainly opposed slavery, originally on sort of a working man's rights kind of basis. Later, clearly also, at least partially, through a kind of moral outrage that he must have developed at some point. Um, but he's always a little tacit when it comes to full black citizenship, for instance. He has a lot of his friends post-Civil War are fairly radical. He isn't. A good friend of his, William Douglas O'Connor, stops talking to Whitman for actually, I think, months or years because he's so outraged about sort of Whitman's lukewarm takes on the prospect of full emancipation, full citizenship. For some reason, so Whitman, both in his poetry and in his private life, begins framing the Civil War as this sort of national epic of sort of fraternal war that then leads to a healing of wounds. And he doesn't really center the question of emancipation, both in his writings about the Civil War, at least largely, as well as in his personal accounts. He not only nursed Northern soldiers but also Southern soldiers, and he has like a love affair with a former Southern soldier later in his life. So um, there's often this argument that Whitman becomes quote unquote more conservative after the Civil War. I think that's also a little bit simplistic, mostly because conservative back then and conservative today are very distinct beasts that are hardly comparable. Um, but yeah, I think by today's standards, certainly you can call Whitman a racist, right? He probably subscribed to multiple attitudes that we would understand to be sort of informed by scientific racism, right? He's a big believer in phrenology, right? The measuring of the bumps in your skull, right? He's into a lot of pseudo scientific fads, including ones with express racial overtones, right? So, yeah, he's better than a lot of his contemporaries, but he's also significantly worse than others, right? We discussed his free soilism at the big Free Soil Convention. Frederick Douglass speaks, right? And Whitman, in writing to the Crescent, says that's not true. He never spoke, right? Because he needs to whitewash the movement for the South, and he's willing to do that.
That's really interesting. Thank you. So Whitman's love of nature is really well known. Did he ever write about the environment in New Orleans? It's very different than New York and southern New Jersey.
He did. Stefan, you want to go first this time?
Yeah, I'm trying to, maybe you can look up the link so we can post that in the chat. But yes, there's a
Mhm.
bunch of references to New Orleans, both to sort of harbor scenes in these larger things that Whitman scholars call catalogs, right? Which is when Whitman in his poetry starts listing a bunch of things and sights and sounds and smells, right? New Orleans always creeps in. Um, but there's a couple of poems in specifically in the 1860s, so at the both inkling that a civil war might happen, but also when Whitman is very interested in westward expansion as the concept, he revisits New Orleans themes, specifically in clusters called Calamus and Children of Adam. Clusters is like poetry groupings in Leaves of Grass. There's a bunch of references to New Orleans there. Most notable is probably something that originally was a coherent, seemingly autobiographical poem. Um, Life Oak. I remember. Remind me of the exact title, Zach.
Oh, is it I saw in Louisiana live oak growing?
Yeah, that's the ultimate poem. That's part of it. But the
Yeah.
longer manuscript is called Life Oak with
Ah,
Moss.
live
Now
oak
it's
with
coming
moss.
back
That's
to
right.
me. And it's
Mhm.
when I read Whitman with my students, that's the Whitman poem they like most. And it's not one that ever gets published, that only exists in manuscript form, and then it gets broken apart and becomes part of Leaves of Grass. But it's a very personal poem about being desperately in love with somebody in a sort of New Orleans, Louisiana setting, and sort of the hurt and the disappointment over the fact that this is either unrequited or aborted in some way, right? And it's probably Whitman's most personal sort of love poem. It's less grandiose than a lot of the other writings, but it's really good. And there's a lot of scholarly debate over why it was never published in its original form. He produced a very clean copy of it that Zach just posted. It's readable. It's a wonderful poem, but he never published it in this version, right? It's a long debate around what kind of version of what we would call homophobia today would Whitman would have encountered, right? homosexuality as a concept didn't exist. There was much more fluidity, and really sort of expressions of affinity between members of the same sex were much more fluid, right? You would hold hands, kiss, confess your love, and it wouldn't technically sort of prescribe any kind of identity to you. But then there are these moves where Whitman sort of hides elements of same-sex attraction, like when he breaks apart that poem. So there must have been something there. But yeah, that's
Yeah.
probably the most direct New Orleans connection there.
Yeah. What I'll add is that Whitman, as the writer of Leaves of Grass, he was drawn more than once to different elements of nature as being a sort of sustained symbol, or even sort of multiple symbol, like a metaphysical conceit, right? A symbol that you can look at different ways, different times. Like when he asked, he in Song of Myself, he says, "A child asked me, 'What is the grass?' and fetched it up to me in childish handfuls." And he says, "I don't know." And then he starts to think about different metaphors. It's the produced babe of vegetation. It's a uniform hieroglyphic. It's the uncut hair of graves. He's like, it's this very rich metaphor. But this isn't the only element of nature that he's used. He writes a poem called "I Saw in Louisiana Live Oak Growing." And then, of course, as I posted and Stefan mentioned, this poetic series, Live Oak with Moss. So it seems like, in addition to grass, and in addition to the calamus root, which is this very phallic swamp plant that Whitman uses as the sort of like symbol of this homoerotic grouping of poems, it seems like live oak really struck him too as this plant that symbolized multiple things that he would only have seen in and around New Orleans. There's not live oak growing in New York. Certainly not with it. If you live in New Orleans, or if you live in Central Texas, like Stefan does, and like I used to do, you're familiar with the sight of live oak with the trailing, moss. And for Whitman, it symbolized lots of things, including things like loneliness. He will recall a solitary live oak later and think about it as not only this sort of tall, sturdy, phallic thing, but also this organism that sort of lives happily without a friend, that it's all by itself and it does not seem to be pensive or lonely in the way that he is. So he's always connecting things like nature to sex and love, to urban centers, to race. These things are always interconnected with him. And I think that's why we find his time in New Orleans so fascinating, is that New Orleans had to have been this overwhelming experience for him, even if it was much mythologized afterwards and oversimplified. It it absolutely left its mark on him, and that's visible in him the rest of his life, and of course in his poetry.
And Whitman rarely gets discussed as sort of a regional poet, which he could have very well been, because after New Orleans, except for like one or two trips, he never really left sort of the New York, Philly kind of
Right?
larger area, right? That's where he stayed, right? He left the country only once to go just right across the border into Canada, but that's about it, right? So he may as well have been like a regional poet, but something happened that allowed him to speak as a national poet, right? And that trip must have had a big role to play in that.
To kind of go off of what you both just were talking about, how do you think his writing was later affected? And can you give like examples of that, of how it was affected by his time here?
I can tell you one myth, and then one reality, and then Stefan can, I'm sure, say a lot too. So Whitman clearly found sensuous enjoyment in New Orleans. I read a passage about how his this beloved coffee cellar of his stuck with him his whole life in his mind. And anybody who has had like a coffee and a beignet in New Orleans will not forget it. Right? It's just the whole city is a cornucopia of these kinds of experiences, as well as meeting different people. He loved to talk with people. He loved to meet and like touch them on the shoulders and write down their names later. Um, what a myth that sort of developed after his life was over was, so there were generations of biographers, at least one, that really strongly endeavored to find heterosexual elements in Whitman's writing and bury anything that was homosexual or bisexual or non-heteronormative, right? There was this prolonged kind of attempt to straighten him out. And so one of the most important myths for that notion was that when Whitman went to New Orleans, he had some sort of dalliance with a woman. The idea was like a mixed race or Creole woman or something. This is complete. This is made up out of whole cloth. There's none of this. Whitman never spoke on this in that way. There's nothing about his writing that suggests this. But the idea was that New Orleans was a sexual awakening for Whitman. Um, uh, Now, that fortunately has now begun to pass. Like most Whitman scholars do not have the sense that Whitman is straight, or anyway, not a Kinsey zero, right? Like he's certainly more sexually fluid or more homosexual than straight. But New Orleans nevertheless leaves its mark on him. And I guess the one reality I would point you to is that Whitman, like Stefan said, Whitman's sense of a city comes from Manhattan and Brooklyn. So he was a farm boy. He grew up in Huntington, Long Island, which was not only rural, I mean, that was the wild in when he was born in 1819. So moving to Brooklyn and then Manhattan, that these were big cityscapes, right? Full of vibrant activity and full of different people. But New York was not nearly as diverse as New Orleans at the time. New York's non-white population, I think we have this in the book, is something like 1.6%. It's 1.6% Black freed people in New York, whereas New Orleans in the time is so much more diverse. Half of the population is non-white, with freed people and enslaved people. So Whitman is going to a place that's not only multicultural, it's multiracial. It's a port city like New York, but it's involved in very different political movements too. It's right. It's the West. I mean, you go much further than New Orleans, and you're no longer in the United States at the time anymore. So it certainly has its effect on him. Shifan, I'm sure there's more that you have to say too.
And it's also a culturally Catholic city, which is
Mm,
also a novelty to him, right? He's sort of Quaker stock. Um, but one of the interesting aspects about New Orleans at the time is that most Catholic churches were desegregated. And they would only get segregated around the time of the Civil War, right? So when Whitman goes to the French cathedral, the big one in the French Quarter, right, he would go to non-segregated masses, and that's interesting. Most churches in Brooklyn were segregated by race. Actually, one attempts to desegregate, and it caused a big outrage. And the person desegregating the church is actually the father of the owner of the Freeman newspaper that Whitman would afterwards work at, right? But that's also a difference. So there's all of these sort of this kind of multitudinous city that feels more sort of ethnically diverse, clearly, than New York. But there's also this experience that Whitman repeatedly describes as a quote, cosmopolitan experience. The idea that you can go to a city that's so different and fit right in. That the young men of New Orleans are indistinguishable to a degree from the young men in New York, right? And this sort of births a kind of cosmopolitan imagination in Whitman, where he, including in the Lifewalk poem, says, well, there must be men like me everywhere. In China, in Russia, they must feel and think like me, right? And this idea is also a starting point to Song of Myself, the center poem of Leaves of Grass, right? That your individual identity is secondary and sort of defined by your environments. The cool thing is that we all have identities, we all have experiences, and that sort of unites us all in this kind of cosmopolitan thing, this cosmopolitan experience of life in the big city, where you meet all of these people for seconds and then they're gone and you'll never meet them again. The kind of identity that comes from that. And I think that really developed through that trip to the other big metropolis that is so different yet so similar in very core ways.
I think we have time for one more question, just to give us a little bit of time for you both to be able to speak on it. Was there something about his time here that was particularly interesting for you guys to learn, something that you did not know? Like any one thing stick out in your minds that changed your view?
That's a
I
good
mean,
question.
the big thing was sort of finding out the voluminosity of his contributions and the utter absence of any sort of inkling of any moral opposition to slavery. Um, that's certainly the sort of most troubling but productively troubling outcome of this. Same with his sort of imperialism against Mexico, right? Which Whitman scholars sort of know about, but reading all of these new documents and looking at the language that he uses to attack Mexico is startling, right? Those are mostly sort of negative surprises. I'm sure there's positive one. It's right. It certainly made him appear more nuanced and more like a real person digging into these conflicts and internal contradictions and the sort of iffiness, right? He's not a hero figure, right? He's a real person that lived in a very real time period, and the sort of advocacy for the peep shows, the burlesques, that was sort of an interesting thing to encounter, right? It feels very Whitmanian. It's interesting to see him sort of slip into almost like a promoter role of that for this newspaper. It's interesting to see him pitch this to an audience we always assumed were sort of conservative. But if you look at it, there's actually much more vibrancy in his readers as well and in the other writers at the paper, right? People always describe the Crescent as this conservative Southern paper because it was sort of tacitly pro-slavery, but most of the writers in the paper were actually from the Northeast, like Whitman, and they had this pretty diverse set of political opinions, from outright advocating for communism to running ads for escaped slaves to endorsing sexually risque performances to, on the other hand, sort of sentimentally bemoaning the terrors of spinsterhood and old unmarried women. It's such a complex milieu that he's in, and seeing that complexity really helped me see sort of early Whitman, pre-Leaves of Grass Whitman in a new light.
Yeah, I feel similarly. I had often wondered why, I mean, it's so small, but why Whitman misremembered being in New Orleans for effectively more than a year, right? That the little handwritten note that I showed, 1848 through 9. This would not be Whitman did not experience senile dementia, as far as we know, late in life. So this would not have made a lot of sense that he remembered being in New Orleans for 2 years when he was there for 3 months. And as Stefan pointed out, and as we discuss in this book, many of the moves he makes, going down, coming back, these job transitions, had very little of this kind of high-flown, you're fired kind of drama, and were much more pre-planned, right? So much of this seems to have been already kind of in the hopper, like even this trip, the idea that he left early is belied by some of the evidence we find that he probably was there for a season deliberately. And so I had wondered why remember it as if it had been such a major portion of his life. But just getting to read his some of his daily contributions to the newspaper, as well as the things that he writes back from New York. New Orleans is just such a rich environment then, just like it is now. I mean, he has, he's writing about these tableaux vivants, right, with nude or like faux nude people standing there titillating lovers of art. He talks about this repeated attempt to launch a balloon. There's a balloon launch that's much touted in New Orleans that does not go well, by the way. It does not end well. Like this sort of German band that's playing that's really famous at the time. All these things that I would not associate with New Orleans, but goes to show that it was an environment of just such organic richness and complexity. No wonder he was just head over heels for it while he was there.
And right, there's always this idea that it's a kind of sexual awakening. And
Mm,
Zach had mentioned how that's always been a very awkward topic in Whitman scholarship and has led to these wild misrepresentations. But we've discovered sort of more nuanced versions of
mm.
that, right? We mentioned Whitman's editors. There was actually a couple of editors, John McClure and Alexander Hamilton Hayes. They actually started at the Delta, and they worked at a different paper before, and neither of them were ever married. And from today's vantage point, it's almost impossible not to read in their biography as we can reconstruct them what we would call a gay couple today. Like from their early youth in New Orleans, they kept working in the same places. They would have these joint ventures, run businesses together. And I showed the Oyster Saloon, right? Sam Weir's Oyster Saloon. And it always struck me as weird that one of the editors would take the nickname Sam at a later point. And we've been able to recover their sort of story. At a certain point, the two editors split up. One follows a queer filibuster to California, the other travels the world. But when that other person is sick, he returns to New Orleans and he dies in the other person's arms. And their graves actually next to each other. And one in the typographers' union, one in another sort of union grave. One dies in the arms of the other. The other is listed as next of kin in the funeral announcement. And then afterwards, that surviving partner becomes involved with Sam Weir of the Oyster Saloon, and when that person dies, he takes on his name. It's a really interesting sort of story that you can find between the lines, and it's interesting to imagine Whitman working in this environment where sort of social sexual behaviors seem to be normalized to the degree that they maybe aren't in New York, right? Sodomy was technically outlawed in New Orleans. It was introduced. It was never illegal in the French part of New Orleans, and when it was still administered by the French, it became technically illegal when American laws were applied, but it seemed to have been rarely, if ever, enforced. And when it was enforced, it was largely enforced in cases of rape. But there seems to have been a wider sort of queer permissiveness in New Orleans that must have been a powerful experience to Whitman.
Thank you. Um, I do have to just ask one more. What happened with that balloon launch? How did it end?
I think there were two
I
scrubbed
believe, yeah.
launches, right? Like they tried and they tried, and then the third time was a charm. And it didn't it popped on the edge of a building and was torn to ribbons by the crowd. Am I remembering that correctly?
So I think it never, like as far as I can tell, it never really succeeded. She got off the ground
Hmm.
briefly once, and people were really pissed. They threw stones at her. Like they
Yeah.
basically ran her out of town.
And I think
And that happened on
Whitman recalls
Lafayette
it.
Square, by the way.
That's right. And is that the one where that literally the crowd tears the silk balloon to ribbons? I think he describes them as
Yeah.
2 inches
They took
wide, like the
souvenirs. So there was no balloon launch after that.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. This was really fascinating, and you both, um, I can tell that you really love the work of Whitman, and it's good to see. And thank you all for the audience for attending as well. Just a reminder that Whitman Southern Sojourn is now available, or is it now? What month did it come
In
out?
like
Okay.
3 days.
In
So
3 days, it will be
yeah.
available from
Yeah.
University of Iowa Press. When I send the recording tomorrow, I'll include a link to purchase the book. And next month's second Thursday lecture will be Remembering the Cajun Past, Memory, Race, and the Politics of Public History in Louisiana with Marc David. And if you enjoyed tonight's lecture, please keep an eye out on the Louisiana State Museum calendar for future programs. The same goes for the Friends of the Cabildo calendar. And if you like what you see, consider becoming a member. Thanks again, everyone, and thanks to our authors, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you all for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a good night.
Goodbye, everyone.